first time Sarah heard the footsteps, she convinced herself it was the house settling. She was 28 years old and had recently moved into a small two-story home outside a quiet town after accepting a new job. Living alone was something she had always wanted. The neighborhood was peaceful, the rent was affordable, and the nearest neighbor lived several hundred feet away. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. Then winter arrived, one particularly cold night in January. Sarah was sitting in her living room watching television when she heard a loud creak above her. The sound came from the second floor. At first she ignored it. Old houses made noises all the time. A few minutes later, she heard another creak, then another. This time it sounded less like the house settling and more like someone taking a slow step across the floor. Sarah muted the television and listened carefully. Silence. After a few moments, she laughed at herself and turned the volume back up. Then she heard again. One step, then another, moving slowly across the upstairs hallway. Her stomach tightened immediately. She was alone. At least she thought she was. Grabbing her phone, she walked upstairs and checked every room. Nothing seemed out of place. Every window was locked. Every closet was empty. Eventually she convinced herself she had imagined it. But over the next several nights, footsteps continued. They always started around the same time, shortly after midnight. Sometimes they lasted only a few seconds. Other times they continued for several minutes. Each time Sarah searched the house and found nothing. The strange noises slowly became part of her routine. Then, one morning she woke up and found something that changed everything. A chair from her upstairs bedroom had been moved into the hallway. Sarah knew she hadn't moved it. She lived alone. No one else had a key. Assuming she had somehow forgotten doing it herself, she carried the chair back into the room and went to work. The next morning, the chair was back in the hallway. This time it faced directly toward the staircase leading down to her bedroom. Sarah felt uneasy, but still tried to find a logical explanation. She purchased a small security camera and placed it at the top of the stairs. For several nights, nothing happened. Then, one morning, she reviewed the footage and felt her blood run cold. At 2:47 a.m., the camera recorded the chair slowly sliding across the hallway floor. There was nobody visible in the recording. No person, no animal, nothing, just the chair moving on its own. Terrified, Sarah called a friend who suggested that someone might be secretly entering the house. Together they searched every room more carefully than before. During the search, they noticed something unusual in the attic. Near the back wall sat an old sleeping bag covered in dust. Beside it were empty water bottles, food wrappers, and a flashlight. Someone had been living there. The discovery horrified Sarah. Police were called immediately. Officers searched the property, but found no one. They believed whoever had been staying in the attic had fled before they arrived. Relieved, Sarah assumed the nightmare was finally over. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, the footsteps returned. This time they sounded heavier than before, more deliberate. One night, Sarah woke up around 3 a.m. after hearing movement directly outside her bedroom door. She froze and listened. A slow scraping sound moved across the hallway floor. Then complete silence. Too frightened to investigate, she stayed awake until sunrise. The next morning she opened her door and found a single photograph lying on the floor. It was an old picture of her house taken years before she moved in. Written across the back were 4 words. "I still live here." Sarah immediately moved out and never returned. Months later, the house was sold to a new owner. During renovations, workers discovered a narrow hidden space inside one of the upstairs walls. Inside they found dozens of photographs. Most showed empty rooms. Others showed previous owners. The most disturbing pictures were recent. They showed Sarah sleeping in her bedroom. None of the photos had ever been posted online. None could explain who took them. And despite a lengthy investigation, nobody was ever identified. To this day, the hidden space remains one of the strangest unsolved discoveries ever connected to the house. Because whoever was taking those photographs seemed to know the home better than the people who lived there. And according to police records, the hidden room could only be accessed from inside the attic where someone had already been living. The question that still haunts Sarah is the same one investigators could never answer. If the person left before police arrived, who was making the footsteps afterward? Emma had lived alone for nearly 3 years when she first noticed the old man. Her apartment building was old, quiet, and mostly occupied by elderly tenants who kept to themselves. Located on the edge of a snowy city neighborhood, it was the kind of place where nothing unusual ever seemed to happen. Emma worked remotely, rarely went out at night, and had grown used to the silence that came with living alone. That was why she immediately noticed him. Every evening around the same time, she would glance out her living room window and see an old man standing across the street. He never moved. He never spoke to anyone. He simply stood beneath a flickering street light looking toward her building. At first she assumed he was waiting for someone. Then she realized he was always looking at the same window. Her window. The sight made her uncomfortable, but she tried not to think about it. Days passed, then weeks, yet the old man continued appearing every night. Then, snow, freezing temperatures. It didn't matter. He was always there, standing beneath the street light with his hands in the pockets of a long dark coat, watching. Emma eventually mentioned him to her neighbor, expecting concern. Instead, the woman looked confused. She claimed she had never seen anyone standing there. Curious, Emma pointed out the window. The old man was there at that exact moment, yet her neighbor insisted the sidewalk was empty. The reaction unsettled Emma more than the man himself. A few nights later, she decided to take a photograph. She zoomed in the old man and snapped several pictures through the glass. When she checked them afterward, every image appeared normal except one. In the final photograph, the old man was much closer. Instead of standing across the street, he appeared directly outside the building entrance. Emma stared at the image in disbelief. She was certain he had never moved while she was taking the pictures. Shaken, she opened the front door camera app connected to the building's security system. The entrance was empty. Nobody stood outside. Relieved, she convinced herself it was a camera glitch. Then the strange noises started. Every night around 2 a.m., she heard slow footsteps in the hallway outside her apartment. The steps always stopped directly in front of her door. Then came 3 knocks. Soft, slow, deliberate. By the time Emma looked through the peephole, nobody was there. The pattern continued for nearly 2 weeks. Footsteps, 3 knocks, empty hallway. One night, she finally gathered enough courage to open the door immediately after hearing the knocking. The hallway was deserted. However, something sat on the floor outside. An old black and white photograph. The image showed her apartment building covered in snow decades earlier. Standing near the entrance was the same old man. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a date. December 12th, 1974. Emma became obsessed with finding answers. She searched local archives and eventually discovered an article about a man named Harold Finch, a retired tenant who had lived in apartment 12B until his death in the 1970s. According to reports, Harold had become increasingly isolated during the final years of his life. Neighbors often saw him staring out his window for hours. One winter evening he vanished. His apartment was found locked from the inside. No sign of forced entry. No evidence explaining where he had gone. His disappearance was never solved. What terrified Emma was the apartment number. Harold Finch had lived in apartment 12B. Her apartment. As winter deepened, the sightings became more frequent. The old man no longer appeared only across the street. Sometimes she saw him standing in a lobby through security cameras. Other times he appeared at the far end of empty hallways. Each sighting lasted only seconds before he vanished. Then came a night everything changed. Emma woke up around 3:40 a.m. after hearing movement inside her apartment. At first she thought she was dreaming. Then she heard the sound again, a chair scraping slowly across the floor in her living room. Her heart pounded as she grabbed her phone and stepped into the hallway. The apartment was dark, silent, empty. Yet one thing immediately caught her attention. A chair from her dining table had been moved directly in front of the living room window, facing outward toward the street. Someone, or something, had positioned it there. Trembling, Emma approached the glass. Snow drifted through the empty street below. Then she saw him. The old man stood beneath the street light once again. But this time he wasn't looking at her window. He was looking directly at her. For several seconds neither moved. Then the old man slowly raised one hand and pointed upward. Confused, Emma followed his gesture toward the apartment building across the street. In one of the dark windows stood another figure, watching her. The moment she looked back toward the street, the old man was gone. The second figure remained. Emma left the apartment the next morning and never returned. Months later, renovations were conducted inside apartment 12B. Workers discovered a small compartment hidden behind a bedroom wall. Inside were dozens of old photographs dating back decades. Most showed residents standing inside the apartment. The newest photograph was the most disturbing. It had been taken only weeks earlier. It showed Emma asleep in her bed. Standing in the doorway was an elderly man wearing a dark coat. Investigators never identified who took the picture. More unsettling still, records showed that Harold Finch would have been over 100 years old if he had still been alive. To this day, tenants living in the building occasionally report seeing an old man standing beneath the street light during snowstorms. Always watching apartment 12B, always waiting, and according to several witnesses, if you stare at him long enough, he slowly points toward a dark window where someone else is already staring back. At exactly 2:43 a.m., Jason woke up to the sound of someone whispering his name from the kitchen. He lived alone. There was nobody else in the apartment. For several seconds, he lay motionless in bed, convinced he had been dreaming. Then he heard it again, a low voice drifting through the darkness. Jason. The sound was so clear that it seemed impossible to ignore. His heart immediately started racing. He grabbed his phone, turned on the flashlight, and slowly stepped into the hallway. The apartment was silent. Every room appeared empty. The kitchen lights were off. The front door remained locked. After checking every corner of the apartment, he found nothing unusual and eventually convinced himself it had been part of a dream. But the same thing happened the following night, and the night after that, always at exactly 2:43 a.m., always the same whisper, always coming from the kitchen. Jason had recently moved into the apartment after accepting a new job in another city. The building was old but affordable, and for several months he enjoyed living alone. Nothing strange had happened until winter arrived. As temperatures dropped, the whispers became more frequent. Sometimes the voice only said his name. Other times it sounded as though someone was trying to say something else before abruptly stopping. The experience became so unsettling that Jason began recording audio every night. For nearly 2 weeks, the recordings captured nothing unusual. Then one morning he reviewed the files and discovered something that made him feel sick. At 2:43 a.m., just before the whisper occurred, another voice could be heard. It was much quieter, almost impossible to notice without headphones. The voice seemed to say, "Don't answer." Jason couldn't explain it. He lived alone. Nobody else should have been inside the apartment. Disturbed by the discovery, he installed security cameras throughout the home. Several nights passed without incident. Then, during a snowstorm in January, one of the cameras captured something unusual. At exactly 2:43 a.m., the kitchen camera activated. Nothing appeared out of place at first. Then a chair slowly moved away from the dining table on its own. It wasn't dramatic. It only shifted a few inches, but there was nobody there to move it. Jason watched the footage repeatedly and could find no explanation. After that night, the atmosphere inside the apartment seemed to change. Small objects appeared in different places. Cabinets he clearly remembered closing were found open the next morning. Sometimes he woke up to discover lights turned on in rooms he hadn't entered. The final straw came one weekend when he left town to visit family. While reviewing live security footage from his phone, he noticed movement inside the kitchen. Some appeared to be standing near the refrigerator. The figure was blurry and partially hidden by darkness, but it was definitely there. Terrified, Jason contacted building security. Officers searched the apartment immediately. They found nobody. Every door and window remained locked from the inside. Yet when Jason returned home, he discovered something new on the kitchen table. An old photograph. The image showed the apartment building during a snowstorm decades earlier. Standing in a second-floor window was a man staring directly toward the camera. Written on the back were the words, "Still here." Jason began researching the building's history and uncovered a disturbing story. Years earlier, an elderly tenant had reportedly died alone inside the same apartment during a severe winter storm. According to neighbors, he often spoke to someone they couldn't see. They assumed loneliness had affected his mental state. One neighbor later claimed she frequently heard him talking in the kitchen late at night, even when nobody else was present. What disturbed Jason most was the date of the man's death. He had been found at approximately 2:43 a.m., the same time the whispers always occurred. As winter continued, the voice became clearer. Instead of simply saying his name, it began speaking full sentences. Sometimes it asked simple questions. Sometimes it sounded frightened. Then one night, Jason finally heard the message clearly. He woke at 2:43 a.m. to the familiar whisper from a kitchen. This time the voice said, "He's standing behind you." Jason spun around immediately. Nobody was there. Panicked, he grabbed his phone and left the apartment. The next morning, he reviewed footage from a bedroom camera. At exactly 2:43 a.m., moments before he woke up, the recording showed a dark figure standing motionless beside his bed. The image lasted only a few seconds before the camera abruptly shut off. Jason moved out less than a week later. Months afterward, construction workers renovating the apartment discovered a narrow crawl space hidden behind the kitchen wall. Inside, they found old newspapers, personal belongings, and dozens of photographs. Most showed previous tenants. Some were taken while the tenants slept. The final photograph was recent. It showed Jason lying in bed on the exact night he heard the warning. Standing beside him was a tall, shadowy figure. What made the photograph truly disturbing was that someone else had taken it, because whoever stood beside Jason was facing the camera, and whoever took the picture was standing inside the room with him. Despite an investigation, nobody was ever identified. To this day, the apartment remains occupied, but several tenants have reported the same strange experience during winter, waking suddenly at exactly 2:43 a.m. after hearing a voice whisper from the kitchen, calling the name. Emily never liked looking out her bedroom window after midnight. She couldn't explain why. The apartment overlooked a narrow alley that ran between several old buildings, and during the winter months the entire area felt strangely empty. She lived alone on the 5th floor and had been there for nearly 2 years without any major problems. Most nights were quiet. She would finish work, watch a movie, and go to bed. Everything changed during a snowstorm in December 2024. Around 1:30 a.m., Emily woke up unexpectedly and glanced toward her window. Standing in the alley below was a man. He wore a long dark coat and stood perfectly still beneath the falling snow. At first she assumed he was waiting for someone, but what unsettled her was the fact that he appeared to be looking directly at her window. Emily stepped away from the glass and returned to bed. The next morning she had almost forgotten about it. Then the man appeared again the following night. Same place, same coat, same motionless posture, looking up at her apartment. Over the next week the sightings continued. Every night around the same time. Every night the man stood beneath the snow watching. Emily eventually told herself it was probably a homeless person or someone waiting for transportation. Yet something about the situation felt wrong. The alley was rarely used after dark. There was nowhere nearby to sit or take shelter, and despite freezing temperatures, the man never seemed bothered by the cold. One night curiosity got the better of her. She picked up her phone and zoomed in to take a picture. The image came out blurry, but one detail immediately caught her attention. The man's face appeared unnaturally pale. His eyes looked completely dark. Emily felt uncomfortable enough to close the curtains and ignore the alley for the rest of the evening. Several days later she returned home from work and found something strange. A photograph had been slipped under her apartment door. It showed the front of her building during a snowstorm. Standing near the entrance was the same man. Written on the back were 4 simple words. "I can see you." Terrified, Emily contacted building management. Security reviewed camera footage from the entrance, but found nobody matching the description. The camera showed no one delivering the photograph. It was as if the picture had appeared on its own. The situation grew even stranger during the following weeks. The man slowly seemed to get closer. At first he stood at the far end of the alley, then halfway down, then directly beneath her window. Emily knew it sounded impossible, but each night he appeared closer than before. She began sleeping with the curtains closed. Then one night she forgot. At approximately 3 a.m., she woke suddenly and looked toward the window. Her blood ran cold. The man was gone from the alley. For several seconds she felt relieved. Then she noticed a reflection in the glass. Someone was standing on the fire escape outside her bedroom window. Emily screamed and jumped backward. By the time she turned on the light, the figure had vanished. Police searched the building and found no signs of intrusion. The fire escape was covered in fresh snow. There were no footprints, no evidence anyone had climbed it. Yet Emily knew what she had seen. After that night, she became obsessed with documenting everything. Cameras were installed throughout the apartment. Motion detectors were placed near every window and door. For nearly 2 weeks, nothing happened. Then, during another snowstorm, one camera activated at exactly 2:50 a.m. The footage showed Emily asleep in her bed. For almost 30 seconds, nothing moved. Then a dark figure slowly appeared outside the bedroom window. It stood motionless, staring into the room. Moments later, the camera feed cut out. When it returned several minutes later, the figure was gone. Emily immediately moved out after seeing the recording. Months later, the apartment underwent renovations. Workers discovered a hidden compartment inside a wall near the bedroom. Inside were dozens of photographs dating back years. Most showed previous tenants standing near the window. Others showed them sleeping. Some appeared to have been taken from inside the apartment itself. The oldest photograph was the most disturbing. It showed the building during a snowstorm nearly 40 years earlier. Standing in the alley was the same man in the dark coat. He looked exactly the same. Same face, same posture, same expression. Investigators never identified him. Former tenants were contacted and several admitted they had experienced similar sightings but never reported them because they feared nobody would believe them. To this day, people living in nearby buildings occasionally claim to see a motionless figure standing in the alley during heavy snowfall, always looking upward, always watching a particular window. And according to some witnesses, if you stare at him long enough, he slowly raises one hand and points toward the room where you're standing, as though he already knows exactly where you live. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't sound. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't even the strange feeling of being watched. It was a photograph Ryan had never taken. Ryan was 29 years old and had been living alone for nearly a year when the picture appeared. His apartment sat on the top floor of an aging brick building that overlooked a quiet snow-covered street. The place wasn't perfect, but it was affordable and far enough from the city that nights were usually silent. Ryan enjoyed living alone. He liked the peace, the privacy, and the feeling of having his own space. But sometime during the winter of 2025, that feeling began to disappear. It started when he returned home from work one evening and found a photograph lying on his kitchen table. The image showed his apartment building during a snowstorm. Nothing seemed unusual until he noticed someone standing in one of the upper windows. The person appeared to be staring directly at the camera. Ryan turned the photograph over and found no writing, no date, no indication of where it came from. Assuming a friend was playing a prank, he tossed it into a drawer and forgot about it. A week later, another photograph appeared. This one showed the hallway outside his apartment door. Again, there was no explanation. No message. Just a picture. Ryan became concerned. He lived alone. Nobody else had access to the apartment. Yet the photographs continued appearing every few days. Some showed empty rooms. Others showed parts of the building. Then one morning, he found a photograph that made his stomach drop. It showed his bedroom. The picture had clearly been taken while he was asleep. Terrified, Ryan searched the apartment from top to bottom. Every window was locked, every door secured. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing suggested another person had been inside. He contacted building management, but they found no evidence of anyone entering his unit. Hoping to catch whoever was responsible, Ryan installed cameras throughout the apartment. For several nights, nothing happened. Then, during a heavy snowstorm, one of the cameras recorded something unusual. At approximately 3:something a.m., a faint sound echoed from inside the bedroom wall. It sounded like movement, not pipes, not the building settling, actual movement. The noise lasted only a few seconds before stopping. Ryan reviewed the footage repeatedly. The sound was unmistakable. Something had been moving behind the wall. At first he convinced himself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Mice, old plumbing, anything. But the noises continued. Every few nights he heard soft footsteps, sometimes scratching, sometimes what sounded like distant whispering, always coming from the same section of wall near his bedroom closet. Then one night he woke suddenly around 3:17 a.m. after hearing a loud thump. The sound came directly from behind the wall beside his bed. His heart pounded as he turned on the light. Everything appeared normal. Then he noticed something strange. A small section of drywall near the closet seemed slightly different from the rest. The paint color didn't quite match. Curious and increasingly unsettled, Ryan examined it more closely the following day. Behind a shelf inside the closet, he discovered a narrow opening concealed by a thin panel. The panel had been painted to blend perfectly with the surrounding wall. When he pulled it aside, he found a dark passageway extending into the building. The space was barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. Ryan immediately backed away and contacted the police. Officers arrived and explored the hidden area. What they found shocked everyone. The passageway connected multiple apartments throughout the building. Hidden access points allowed someone to observe tenants without being seen. Blankets, food wrappers, flashlights, and personal belongings were scattered throughout the narrow corridors. Someone had been living inside the walls. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. Deep within the hidden space, investigators found dozens of boxes filled with photographs. Hundreds of them. Images of residents spanning decades. Some showed people sleeping. Others showed them watching television, cooking dinner, or sitting alone at night, completely unaware they were being photographed. The collection stretched back more than 30 years. Yet one detail immediately stood out. In dozens of photographs, the same unidentified man appeared somewhere in the background, standing in hallways, watching from dark corners, peering through doorways. The strange part was that he never appeared to age. Photos taken 30 years apart showed the exact same face, same expression, same dark winter coat, same hollow stare. Investigators searched records for anyone matching his appearance, but found nothing. Then they uncovered something even more unsettling. Hidden among the photographs was a small journal. Most entries were impossible to understand, filled with fragmented notes and strange observations about the building's residents. However, one section described a man who supposedly lived within the walls long before the current tenants moved in. According to the journal, several residents over the years had reported hearing footsteps inside their walls during winter storms. Others claimed they occasionally saw a face watching them through narrow openings before disappearing. Most dismissed the stories as paranoia. Yet the reports continued appearing decade after decade. Ryan moved out immediately after the discovery. He never spent another night in the apartment. Months later, the building underwent extensive renovations. Workers sealed the hidden corridors permanently and removed everything found inside. The mystery should have ended there. But one final discovery continues to disturb investigators to this day. While cataloging the photographs, they found an image developed nearly 8 months before Ryan signed his lease. The photograph showed the inside of his apartment exactly as it would appear after he moved in. His furniture stood in place. His belongings sat on shelves. Even the framed picture beside his bed was visible. Yet Ryan had not lived there when the photograph was taken. In fact, he hadn't even seen the apartment yet. Standing in the background of the image was the same unidentified man seen throughout the collection, looking directly into the camera, smiling. Nobody could explain how the photograph existed. Nobody could identify the man. And despite years of investigation, one question remains unanswered. If the hidden passageways have been empty when police searched them, who was taking the photographs all those years? And who was still living inside the walls after everyone else left?